We're talking today with Dr. Richard Rasmussen of East Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Dr. Rasmussen, can you start by giving us some background on yourself? To begin with, where and when were you born?
Well, I was born in the country 3 miles south of Lakeview, Michigan, north of Greenville, and I grew up my first 2 years there, and then the family moved out to east of Greenville, between Greenville and Sheridan, and I was 5 miles from Greenville, and the farm is still there, owned by one of the grandsons, and his family, and I walked to country school, to a wee school.
Yes. In what year were you born?
I was born on June 4, 1913.
Okay. All right.
So we're now very close to 98.
Now, was the school a one-room school, or was it
One
divided?
room school, about 15 or 20 pupils, 8th grades, and that was 1.25 miles from home. And we walked all the way, and all the way back in the afternoon. Carried a lunch pail, whatever books we had, and that was a good experience. And then I graduated from there and went on to the Greenville High School, which is pretty well known around here, and graduated from there in 1931.
Okay. Now, at this point, had the beginnings of the Depression affected your family at all?
This was before the Depression.
Well, the crash is 29, and it takes a few years for the ripple effects to come out and really affect people.
Oh, yes. Well, in 1931, we had the Depression starting.
Yeah.
It was well underway. And I was able to, a principal called me and asked me what I planned to do with my future, and I really didn't have any big plan because I didn't have any money. So he said, well, he thinks you should go to college. I better try Olivet, which he knew someone in Grand Rapids who was a graduate of Olivet, and that was John McNaughton. He was a broker over here in Grand Rapids. And I went over to see him, and from there was directed to go over to Olivet College at Olivet near Battle Creek to give them my credentials, and they might be able to help me. So I got a scholarship there right through college for my tuition, which was $125. And I kept on with that right there, and I still wanted to, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a physician if I could be, but that was a long road.
Okay. Now, did you have to work while you were in school to pay for food?
While I was in school. I got 25 cents an hour.
And what kind of work were you doing?
Mostly in the dining area. Got up in the morning and sliced oranges and sliced bread for the students who came in early, so I had to get up early. And I got 25 cents on the books. But of course, college didn't cost so much in those days, but board and room was what I had to work for. And I was able to get through the Battle of Olivet, we called it, with one of my roommate, who was Hal Reams from Grand Ledge. And we were together for years, and we're still, he's deceased now, but we still did a lot of communicating. But anyway, we knew of some people there who'd gone on to the University of Chicago, and I decided I'm going to try for that. And I did. And I was given assistance at the university, so I did some working at the university also, but that's the way I made it.
Okay. And that was where you went for medical school?
At the University of Chicago.
All right.
And that's a good school, one of the best, but not the top in numbers of people and pupils and so on, students. But it is, I think, one of the major universities of this country.
Well, since I went there as an undergraduate, I'm inclined to agree.
Pardon?
I went there about 40 years after you got out, but yes, I was an undergraduate there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's all right. That's good.
Yeah. Now, can you describe a little bit what the medical school experience was like for you? Because this is the 1930s, and so people might not have...
Well, I lived at 611 Ethel, and 611, not Ethel. I lived in Ethel Street here.
Mm-hmm.
6'11", it misses it at the moment, but anyway, I was there, 6118 Woodlawn. Yeah.
Yeah. So just
And
immediately.
you know about where that is?
Yeah, that's going to be south
It's
of the Midway.
South of the Midway, right.
Mm-hmm.
And then I walked over to the university for my classes and so on, and I stuck that right out there. And I was married back in 1936. My wife, a friend at Olivet, I had met her at Olivet, and we continued going together. She was teaching school in Muskegon. So we were married in 1936 in the summer, and she lost her job when she married.
Mm-hmm.
So that was quite a struggle at that time because we didn't have much money. And I still was out on the limb to a couple of relatives, which I'd borrowed a little money from as I went along, $50 now and then, one of my uncles over in Greenville. And I had another one in Lansing who helped me a little bit too. So I was able to get a little money if I needed it, but I was pretty careful.
Now,
Anyway,
was your wife able to work in Chicago, or did she just?
I did work mostly in the laboratories.
But did your wife work in Chicago?
She eventually got a job in a lying-in hospital, women's hospital over there, part of that complex. And she and one of my friends from Salt Lake City, we talked to the nurse in charge lying in and said we had 2 wives that needed clerk work, something.
Mm-hmm.
So they were clerks at lying in hospital. And got a little money. And I had a stipend from the university also at $100 a month. So that was helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But I eventually paid those monies back with interest, all of them. But anyway.
Yeah. Now, was medical school 3 years at that point, or?
No, it was. I combined my work there. I worked at Olivet one summer, took extra courses, and then I worked at the college in the summer, a couple of them. And I was able to graduate in March of 1938. Combined, and was there in school one summer, so I made it in 7.5 years, and then progressed over to Grand Rapids at that time, and was an intern at Blodgett, 1938 and 9, 1 year. But then I had considered going into the Navy in the fall of 1938 because the war clouds were beginning to form, and there wasn't much doubt that eventually I would at least be a good service in the Navy. So I took the exams over at Great Lakes in 1938 in the fall, and was one of 9 that were accepted. And then I was ready to go to the Naval Hospital in the spring, and I had an invitation to go back to the University of Chicago to train in surgery. So I deferred my Navy project and returned to the university, and was there for 3.5 years.
Now, what specialization did you train in?
I wanted to go into general and then thoracic surgery. Thoracic surgery was a specialty just beginning to evolve, mostly tuberculosis, and treatment of that. And it's before we had drugs. So I had considerable training right there at the university in surgery, and doing laboratory work too.
All right. Now, you mentioned that you were, as far back as 38, you were paying attention to what was going on in the world and realizing that a war could happen. Were most of the people you were working with also aware of that kind of thing, or did they just focus on medicine?
I think that the university was aware of some of the likelihood of what might happen.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife, of course, we have to take care of her, and she returned here to Michigan while I was an intern, and taught school over in Rockford, just a country school just outside of Rockford, and also lived in Rockford, and then we moved to Chicago. We were even one of the apartments down on 68th Street. I think there was an apartment building when we first got that. She was a ran the switchboard there at the apartment building. And then later on, got back and while I was in school, she read to some of the semi-blind students at the university. So that was a good thing. She was an English science major.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a good one in Muskegon. And they couldn't, the person they got a hold of to handle the kids over in Muskegon was not quite up to par, so they wanted her to come back.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of a disturbance from the routine.
Right, because they had let her go because she got married originally.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, it was
That's
common enough in those days.
They
Teachers
were
were
not
not supposed to
hiring
marry.
married women.
Yeah.
That's all there was to it. There weren't enough people, too many jobs, and there
Mhm.
weren't enough people,
Right.
good candidates. And she was a good teacher. Anyway, we declined on that one because we were getting by.
Mhm.
And
All
so,
right. So you get to, so basically, were you still then, you were working still at the University of Chicago when Pearl Harbor happened?
yes, I was there in residency.
Okay.
And when Pearl Harbor happened, that was a catastrophe. And I knew, and everybody else knew, that we were going to be involved in that. We had to. We rose up as a nation. And in 2.5 years, which could not have been done today, 2.5 years, we rose up, we were manufacturing, we were building tanks, we were on the beaches of Normandy, about 2.5 years after that attack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Roosevelt was at least building up the arms industry and that kind of
Well,
thing, and building up
he
the army
was,
even
and
before the war started.
Hoover
but-
was the president at the time, and Roosevelt came in with the New Deal, as usual, and we were supplying arms to the Allied forces,
Mhm.
to Britain, and we were sympathetic with them, and we were helping shipbuilding for them. That was a turmoil period of history.
Okay. Now, how would you learn about world events at that point? Was it newspapers or radio or?
Well, we had a Pony Time magazine. That was a small magazine. It was about probably 6.5 by 4, and thin. Could be sent easily. That was the Pony magazine, a Time magazine, and that's one we heard. And then also radio. We had radios at that time, but they were small radios, small unit. So we listened to Eric Seberide in a European area,
Mm-hmm.
in Finland and that area.
Right.
World War II.
So you have the Winter War in
Reporting
Finland
of
and
course,
Poland and France and all that.
Later on, when I was in the Navy, I listened to Tokyo Rose tell us how terribly things were going.
Right. Okay. Now, after Pearl Harbor happened, did you get called up or report for duty, or what happens?
The university declared 3 of us in the surgery department as residents who were there, and we were sufficiently trained to go on into the military.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 3 of us that left the university at that time in the summer of 1942, and declared available and trained as surgeons. So I went in. I had thoracic surgery as my primary thing, but we didn't have a lot of thoracic surgery at that time. I learned more in the laboratory there in Chicago than I did because at that time we were working on dogs. We were beginning to do some work in getting into the heart, slow and very fast and rapid activities, and experimenting with the valves on dogs at the university. So I was somewhat prepared for that, and also, of course, we knew about tuberculosis.
Okay. Now, did you go to work at Great Lakes, or where were you assigned first? When you entered the Navy, where do they assign you first?
Well, I was first assigned to Great Lakes Naval Training Station. That's what they did most of the people coming in. That was the summer of 1942. And I left for the Navy in August of 42 with one of my friends from Chicago. We drove up Lakeshore, and went to the naval training station. They had 75,000 coming in the Navy. Right then, they came in by train, mostly from the west, because that was the 9th Naval District. There's several states from the north central states. And I was there for a month and a half, helping with the recruits. And then was assigned to the Navy's Seabee training base out in Davisville, Rhode Island, near Providence. And there was assigned to the 66th Naval Seabee Battalion. And I then stayed with them until I was returned to the States. But I was assigned, I was lucky.
Mm-hmm.
My friends, some of them were involved with the South Pacific.
Right.
And because that was a very active thing. It got going later on. But I was assigned to the 66, and we were several battalions working on mainly Adak, but they'd had a battle at Attu to get the Japanese out of there. They also got over around Dutch Harbor too. So Alaska was not a state at that time. Alaska became a state later in June of 1958, I believe. I'd have to check that.
Let's back up a little bit into your story here. You're sent out to Rhode Island, you're assigned to the Seabee Battalion,
Right.
and then you're there for about 3 months before you move out?
No, I was there for 21 months.
No, but were you in Rhode Island for all that time?
On the island, yes.
No, in Rhode Island.
And mostly on Adak.
Right.
We had a contingent that went over to Attu, but
Right. No, I'm just trying to make sure that we follow each piece of your itinerary. So you
Right.
go from Chicago to Rhode Island with the base where the Seabees are training, right? Okay. Now, how long did you stay with them in Rhode Island before you
we were
went?
there about, I would say we were there, I remember being there Christmas Eve, and most everybody was out of the barracks, and I sat there and listening to Bing Crosby sing White Christmas. A little lonely.
Okay.
And my wife was here in Grand Rapids. We had moved here in 1942. Before I left for the Navy,
Mm-hmm.
we moved over here in a house on 57 Benjamin, just off Fulton Street. That house is still there. We had shared an apartment there, and shared it, part of it at some time with Hal Reams, who was coming along. He and I had been Olivet together.
Mm-hmm.
So he followed my tracks pretty much here. He came over to Blodgett to get internship or residency. And he also got a PhD from University of St. Louis. But later, because he was in the military too. But anyway, I was there, and I was with the Seabee Battalion. We had Eddie Rickenbacker came through. He was rescued from the Pacific in flight. And Roosevelt came up there too. That's the first time I'd seen him or any president. And he went by us in a command wagon, and we had to get out there and get our uniforms out, salute the president.
Now, was this when you were in Alaska?
That was when I was on Adak.
Yeah, on Adak. Okay, when did they send you out to Adak? When did you arrive in Alaska?
We took the train across country from Davisville, Rhode Island, by train, or 2 trains, the whole battalion, about 1,100 people, or a little more. Took the train across country, and we had to pay for our meals. Well, we didn't pay them on the train. You know, I was subsequently billed for those meals, I think 85 cents for meals. Because we were supposed to pay for our own meals.
Because you were
But
officers?
they fed us on the train anyway. And then we went to Port Hueneme down near Los Angeles and near Santa Barbara. And from there, we traveled by train up to Seattle and left there by ship for the Aleutians, and we stopped briefly at Dutch Harbor, and then on out on the chain of Aleutian. Adak's about 600 miles along the chain toward Japan, toward the Kurils, off the coast of Russia now, and down toward Japan. So we we were much closer to Japan than they were over in the mainland. And we lived in, first we were in tents.
What do you remember about the sea voyage itself?
The seaboard.
What was that like to ride on the ship all the way out there?
Well, our dentist was sick most of the way, I remember that. His name was Dempsey, and he came from Indiana. And he was sick, so he was laid up in bunk. And it didn't bother me. It was kind of interesting, but it was a rough sea. We had a troop ship, and we hoped there wouldn't be any submarines, because the submarines have been very busy in the Atlantic Ocean. But they hadn't gotten to the Pacific, and that's why we were up there. We were there to make sure they had suitable airfields, and that's what we were doing, building airfields. I have a book about that, I'll show it to you, because that's considerable interest.
All right. Okay. So then, how long did you spend up at Adak?
I was there for 21 months, and then we came back to the States by way of troop ship. And as I recall, we were ready to get back to see civilians, because we hadn't seen many people up there, only our own groups. And I remember crossing under the Golden Gate Bridge at on Christmas Eve of 1944. 44. I was a whole year at Adak, almost a year and a half. Oh, more than a year and a half. And when I crossed under the Golden Gate Bridge, I looked up and saw the lights. They were down below. You couldn't see the bridge. And then we went to Camp Parks, which is outside of Oakland, for reassignment and also R&R, supposedly. We were there for about 3 weeks. And then I was assigned to the Naval Hospital at Great Lakes, where I was able to make a very significant contribution.
Now,
we had a large hospital. There were 9,000 bed hospital, and we had primary hospitals where I worked, and we had wards around that. Have you ever been to Great Lakes?
No.
Anyway, it's a substantial facility, and a good train service, good traffic service, and then we lived down at Lake Bluff, right on the lake shore, 50. Lake Sunrise Avenue, Lake Bluff. We were there for over 2 years.
Okay. Now, I want to go back to Alaska here. I want you to tell me a little bit what your life was like while you were in Adak.
Well, the nights are quite long, particularly in the wintertime, and it's cold, but it's near the sea, and so it wasn't extremely cold, but we had a lot of snow. And that, of course, impeded our work. But we lived in Quonset hut, and I lived in a hut with about 6 other officers of the battalion. And I wrote to my wife usually something every day, but I sent it out every week at least. And that took about usually 10 days to 2 weeks to get back. So they were a little behind on what's going on. I was too with the kids, because by that time I had 2 children. I had they were both born in Chicago before I left. My second one was, the older one was born on Roosevelt's birthday in 2000. Well, anyway, her birthday was on January 30 of 1943. 43. No, she was born in 41.
Okay.
Just a minute. She was born while I was in training at university. She was born, I think, probably in 1941. And then the son, the picture is right behind me here, is an MD. He was born on March the 22nd of 1944. I was at the Naval Hospital at the time, and My daughter was also born along about that time, and that was the second daughter. She's a teacher down in Georgia. She was born in 1944, 45. Anyway.
Okay. To go back to Alaska,
Okay.
how were you supplied? How did you get mail? How did you get food? That kind of thing.
That came by, I think that probably came by air from Seattle, and also by ship, if there was anything else came by. But it took about 2 weeks to get it up there, unless it came by air. But it came by air usually within a week.
Now, was there an airfield at Adak? So there was.
Yes, we had built one. We had to build it, and that was quite an interesting thing too, because they had to smooth off the area where to build it. Then they had to lay a metal track, and that track had to be eventually solidified because heavy aircraft come in, and the track would kind of wave. It wasn't all completely solid unless they put concrete on too.
Now, what kind of work did you actually have to do?
I was working as a junior medical officer with a battalion. We had a senior and a junior. I was a junior, and I had a senior from Oak Park, Illinois, by the name of Vernon Nerger, Nerger. And that worked pretty well. And we had 1,100 men of our own, and we also saw some of the rest of them. Other battalions, there were 2 or 3 battalions up there working. And we had heavy equipment. It was a struggle, but they did build airfields and hangars.
Now, did you mostly have to deal with people getting colds or flu or things like that?
Well, we had, fortunately, my battalion was mostly service people, like plumbers, carpenters, and there were carpenters. And our battalion could build a hut faster than the civilians could. When they came in, they couldn't work very well together because the civilians weren't as interested in getting the job done as we were. We were interested in getting the job done over with and back home. Our communication also with, I had a map here, I'll show it to you. It's I don't know whether it's over there, over here. Anyway, it's a map that you may want to look at that. I'll show it to you. That's how we knew what was going on.
Oh.
I don't see it
Well,
right here.
we can
It's
do that.
an interesting map because it was put out by Sears Roebuck and Company for a Chicago company at that time, and they had it pretty well plotted out. So I followed the war with that particular map.
Okay. Now, how would you get information about the war while you were out
Radio.
there?
We had a radio. We had a small radio.
And was there an armed forces network or something like that you listened to?
They had an armed forces network too, but we listened quite a bit to Tokyo Rose because she told us about the things. Didn't tell the truth, but we knew from the Time magazine information, and you couldn't write about what's going on in the war in your letters.
Right.
I was a censor at the battalion level, and I also had charge of a barber shop and the laundry and the tailor shop and the shoe shop. So I had to be sure they were all kept in order. So I had things to do.
Okay. Now, did you have much work to do as a doctor?
Yes, I did. I moderate amount. We had a sick bay building. That was a Quonset hut, or anyone who was injured. And the injuries were quite often what brought people in, maybe fractures or lacerations, skin, fingers, toes, and routine things. These people were older than the usual recruits. The old usual recruits are 18 to 21. Once in a while somebody got in younger than that. But anyway, they were subject to a different thing. And I learned that more when I came back, because the first thing they caught was respiratory infections when they were brought in from various areas around in the 9th Naval District, Iowa, wherever they come. They came by train to Great Lakes. And then after returning here, I was able to move my family, who had been over on Benjamin Street, 57 Benjamin, in an apartment. After my first 2 years up there, we got them over, and they lived at Lake Bluff, right near the Great Lakes Station. That was kind of a pleasant time. My daughter was born while we lived there, my second daughter. And then after the war ended, which I recall quite vividly, there was a big celebration. We went out west of Milwaukee, or not Milwaukee, but Waukegan, and there was a big celebration going on out there. It's noise, so like you see in the only small crowds, but compared to what we see today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, how long then do you stay in the Navy at that time?
I stayed in until I think January of 1940. 46. I came to Grand Rapids, started my work at the end of the year, but I stayed in the Navy probably until I'd have to look at the records on that. But anyway, I checked out of the Navy and almost immediately signed up for the reserves right away.
Mm-hmm.
So I continued with that right on until I was retired in June of 1973. And that was involved service once or twice a week during the Korean conflict. And then also we got over into the Vietnam conflict. And that was the time when I retired.
Mm-hmm. Now, what kind of duties did you perform then while you were in the reserves? Yeah.
In the reserves? Mostly down at we started over here at the Armory, which was down here at the end of Wealthy Street in East Grand Rapids. There was an old armory there. You remember that?
No.
Well, anyway, there was one. We started out there, and then they built the one down at on Lower Monroe, which is down near Knapp Street.
Mm-hmm.
That was built, and we moved in over there, and we were examining recruits from this whole area. They'd come in and be sent to the Korean conflict back in the 50s. And then also the Vietnam conflict. I remember doing some work out there. We had 2 dentists that rotated and provided service, and we had I think 3 different doctors that were on. J.D. Miller, you might never know about him, but he was there. He and I signed up together. We'll stay with them. They needed help, and some of the rest of them didn't want any more to do with the military, so they said goodbye.
Okay. Now, how do you think being in the military affected you? Did you gain anything from the experience or learn things?
Particularly over at Great Lakes, I gained a lot of experience there because that was a large hospital, and I had one ward of 44 beds, and then I had to have another one because I began to collect patients that had been over there. And I saw a great many of the wounded come back. There were Marines, and some Navy also, but largely Marines, because they'd come in from the West Coast. They'd been injured about 2.5 to 3 weeks before.
Mm-hmm.
Primary care given at the time, they were salvaged. So I wound up dealing with the leftover problems, and there were a lot of problems. I had 84 beds at one point over there. I just saw a lot of empyema, infections of the chest, chest wounds, got infected, clothing or whatever, and hemorrhage. And so I saw a lot of that. I also saw some of the people from the camp there. They were still in camp, where we were getting recruits coming in, even then, and they would have respiratory infections. Sometimes would have pneumonia, and they had a lot of. First thing I saw was penicillin being used.
Mm-hmm.
When I got back here, we hadn't had any of that before. We'd had sulfanilamide and so on, but we didn't have penicillin. That was a miraculous drug.
So you got a lot of practical experience as a doctor
I did.
then,
Oh yes,
at that point.
I did, because I had to treat hemothorax. That's where there's injury to the chest and they close it up and there's blood in the chest and that has to be cleaned out before it heals properly. And so I did a lot of those. Probably had as many there as most any other place in the hospital system,
Mm-hmm.
in the Navy or Army. And that was a gradually increasing experience.
Now, was that an experience that you could draw on in civilian life
Yes,
when you got out of there?
right. Oh yeah. Yeah, I had done some tuberculosis work back in before at the university, but that came in after I got back here. It was still being prevalent. We
Mm-hmm.
still had 100 beds out here or more at Sunshine Hospital.
Now, what kind of treatment could you provide for tuberculosis at that point?
Rest, pneumothorax, rest of the lung, air, chest. That was early on, and gradually as they healed, they had to go. Bed rest was the prevailing types of treatment at that time. And then if they got an infection or had trouble of that kind, they did, then we'd have to do some surgery and collapse therapy, take out the ribs, collapse the chest. So that became a going thing. And then penicillin and streptomycin came in and some other antibiotics. So that began to get the disease a little under control. But we still have it here in some of our immigrants who come over here and sneak in and don't get checked out. And people come from other lands today. They don't even take x-rays as far as I know. They ask questions, but at that time, if they had anything wrong, we sent them back.
All right.
Today, well, that's become one of the current problems.
Okay. Now, once you are off active duty in the Navy and you come back to Grand Rapids now, do you set up your own practice?
That was in. I left the Navy in August or September. I had a lot of accumulated vacation.
Right.
So I used that up in trying to find a place to go, and I did searching around. I considered Minneapolis, St. Paul. That'd been okay for me. But I really felt that I wanted to come over here and start it in this community, which I did. And at the dismay of a few of my colleagues, they thought she's crazy. But anyway, I came here because I felt there was a great opportunity here. And that has proved to be the case.
And can you describe a little bit what that first part of your career in Grand Rapids was like? What were you doing? And
well, I lived over at 611 Ethel Street, and I first of all was looking for some sort of a job, and I got a hold of the tuberculosis work that was being sent over from Sunshine over to Ann Arbor. And they had to stay there for quite a while, so I convinced the people here that we ought to do them here in Grand Rapids and avoid the hospital stay over at Ann Arbor. And I went over there to talk to those people. They had a lot of tuberculosis work there too at the university. And I knew 2 or 3 of those people, so I wanted to go and make sure I was welcome to go get involved with it. So I stopped there, and they said there's work over there. Just go and get a hold of it. So I did, and I got St. Mary's Hospital. They were the only ones that would set up an isolation unit, so we had to keep them separate from the rest of the hospital. And they did that, and so I worked there from that point on. Probably in January of 47. I had already gotten started over at Blodgett in 46, December. I opened my office long in November, and at Blodgett Medical Building. It's gone now, taken out. But anyway, I got a hold of that, and then I got a hold of another job. used to, Dr. McCann over at the prison at Ionia died. And Ron Yaw, who was the director over at Blazett, who was just back from the Army too, a little further, and he knew my plight. And he called me and said that he knew about that and suggested I might want to look into it, and I did. I went over there to see him, and then carried on that work for over a year and a half, almost 2 years. And by that time I'd gotten busy over here, so I recommended that they send it over and have the people at Ann Arbor, have the residents take care of those people, which they did. Get the local people in Ionia to help with it. So I had that for almost 2 years. I went over there twice a week in the morning for sick call at the prison. That's an experience in itself too, like, you know, because they're always looking for get off any duty they were on. They didn't want to work. Some of them. So that was an interesting experience. And then the tuberculosis work, I also was doing that at St. Mary's.
Now, at what point in your career do you start working with the heart-lung machine and that kind of technology?
Well, I started doing some congenital hearts without any pump. We didn't have a pump at that time. We knew that that might be a possibility in the future. I started doing some congenital hearts right away, and at Blazett, and they were patent ductus, coarctations. We did quite a few of those. They hadn't been treated adequately. They had not been referred to either Chicago or Detroit or Ann Arbor, what they did. And the medical profession was not quite up on the possibilities either. And I had to go around and promote that, talk about the things that could be done for some of these people, because they either have to be treated or else they might die early on in life. And of course, a lot of the blue babies just all died eventually at that time. But I got involved in that too, because a doctor over at Children's Hospital in Chicago began doing some of those. And I collaborated with him and began to do them here too. And it's quite interesting how things evolve, phases. In 1949, I was involved by way of the University of Chicago with the development of a group of people we called the CHEST Club, C-H-E-S-T Club. And we had about a dozen people involved in it at that time, and people in Chicago area primarily, and these one that were at the universities elected me to be their secretary, and I, being the youngest of the crowd, really, I was their secretary for 33 years. That plate over there identifies a whole host of these people at that time from the north central states who were members of that outfit. And we met twice a year, and we talked about what we were doing. And each time we met, whether it was Chicago, and we were over here once or twice, or 3 times all together, we showed them what we were doing. We were innovating. We were experimenting. Showed them how we built the hard lung machine. We went up to Minneapolis to see what they were doing up there too, and they were quite active. And that's how we developed the whole system, which today is routine. And that's that machine I suggested you should go stop over there and look at that exhibit at Blazett, because that's quite a significant relation of what we did to develop and accomplish the first case, which was done now in 1958, November 11 of 1958.
And was that done here?
Yes, I did it over at Blazett.
All right.
By that time, I had picked up extra partners. I had first partner I had was Richard Mead, who came here, and he'd never done any cardiovascular work, and didn't intend to, but he had gotten out of the Army, he'd been around Philadelphia before the war, and gotten out of the Army and married a woman from Grand Rapids. And he called me and from Chicago. He got out and went to Chicago briefly to work with a couple of people down there on the north side, Dr. Head and a few others, and wanted to come to Grand Rapids because his wife had been here. So he came and joined me in '48, and I was still working on the TV work and working at Ionia.
Mm-hmm.
And about that time, I was getting busier, and so I was glad to have him come. He was older than I was, but anyway, he was helpful. And then I had to go back to the University of Chicago and do some of my work in the laboratories because we didn't have one. But we eventually got Blodgett to pull it out. I went over there and I found a person by the name of Claire Basinger coming out of his residency. I said, why don't you come and help me? He was from Ohio, Oberlin, Ohio, and University of Ohio. And he was there in the residency, and so he came over here. He came over here in '55. Got him over here, and so together we developed a work with where we could have some dogs down in the sub-basement of Blodgett Hospital,
Mm-hmm.
right in the Blodgett Hospital. We developed an operating room down there, took it down there, and we had those dogs. We had to cut their cords so they couldn't bark, or like it did make a noise, but they didn't bark, just like we had done at the university
Mm-hmm.
before the war. You can't have dogs barking around the hospital. And so we were able to get the group together, get some technicians, get nurses to help, assistants, and then we did the first case in 1958. I think it'd be well worth your time to just stop over there and look at that because that's a significant historical exhibit.
All right.
That shows you some pictures. I'll show you one out here in the hall of some of my friends out there too.
All right. Now, basically, then, did you kind of continue just to develop the practice and improve it? Then.
Oh yes. Oh yes. We became quite busy. I worked when I first came here. I would work at Blodgett, Butterworth, and St. Mary's. I did that for almost 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
and then Butterworth hired 2 people to come to work over there. They offered me the opportunity. And Ragsdale was the superintendent at the time. He talked to me about that. I said, well, I can't really do that. I think working in 3 places in one day is not
Mm-hmm.
too feasible. And they went ahead and hired Dr. Schlosser and Kenny, and they came from Detroit area. Well, it's all right. I wouldn't go over there. I was doing heart cases for the
Mm-hmm.
children's section of the state health department, and they wanted me to come over there and do that. I said, well, I can't do that. So that's when they drew the line on me. But I still did some work over there occasionally. But gradually it moved to Blodgett and St. Mary's and then I got rid of the job at the prison, and we kept on with the Sunshine, doing work here too, and we did that at St. Mary's. But it all worked along, but it's a gradual evolution of a ability to do certain things. And now the Heart Center, the Meyer Heart Center, is that developments come in, for now about 10. And the Meyers, I knew Fred Meyer. His father used to cut my hair when I was a kid. And it cost 25 cents. Who works today for 25 cents? But 25 cents was a lot of money in that day.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the dollar and what's happened to the dollar. Today, 44 cents is a postage stamp.
All right. Are there other particular significant points in your medical career that you'd like to put on the record here while we're going?
Well, I was always a I guess I was cited for being an innovator and in the Physician Society and in Spectrum Health. I got into that in 1999.
Mm-hmm.
I was elected then with 2 or 3 others. So I'm a proud member of the Emeritus Physicians Society. And as such, I attend certain meetings and so forth. They put on a luncheon now, tell us what's going on. It's new, and quite often go along with other people, go to retired doctors.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, early on I became interested in tobacco. I knew that tobacco was harmful. That had been reported, and I've got information now that goes even back down to 1925 when tobacco was under suspect. And by 1952 I had a book, a pharmacology book that was published in 52, and it has 17 pages of information about the harmful effects of tobacco.
Mm-hmm.
It's a multicultural, multifaceted thing. It affects the respiratory system, it affects the gastrointestinal system, it affects the urinary tract system, and by cancer, by the products that are in tobacco. So I began my history cases. In 1948, I began working on that and recording the histories of the smokers that I saw, so much cancer of the lung,
Mm-hmm.
awful. And they were practically all cigarette smokers. So we got after that and began to record it, and then I sort of volunteered my services to the Michigan Air Pollution Commission. They have a physician member of that, and the one that was on there, I knew him from Battle Creek, and I was offered the position by Governor Milliken back in 1969, and I stayed with them until 76. But anyway, during that time, I got smoking out of the Air Commission meeting and smoking. I couldn't handle that, so I got a couple of colleagues busy and said, I'm going to have a resolution. We get smoking out of this damn commission. And we got that through. That hit the newspapers, and from that point on, I was busy in the legislative area, and I've got boxes of information about testimony down before people in Lansing to get it out of public places.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the libraries, the schools, and so on. And we got it out of there in 1972. We got it out of the medical society too. They were sitting around smoking.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't ever smoke much. I did a little, but not much. And I got it out of the societies, and we got it out of the Air Commission, and then we got it out of the public places, the schools, libraries, and so on. And now, after I retired in '83, I continued to work with some of our physicians here. We go into the schools and talk to them, and Dr. Tomatis over at Spectrum at Butterworth was hooked up with the DeVos family, and of course they had the money, so they helped with the money to get into the schools, and the medical society also helped with that. So we had a group of about a dozen or 20 doctors who would go into the schools, and even up until 3 or 4 years ago, I was going into schools with some of them, talking about hazards of tobacco, and now, just in 62 years after that, we finally get it out of even the workplaces,
Mm-hmm.
and there've been a lot of opposition to that.
Yeah.
The veterans, they're going to build a place to smoke house outside. Well, I'm not sure whether that's going to come about or not, but a couple of legislators said they could. Well, that's an exception. They also smoke at the casinos, and I think that we all know that the tobacco is a harmful product. But I did a lot of work on that, and I probably have more information about the harmful effects of tobacco than most anybody else around.
Now, over the course of the time when you're working on tobacco and you're trying to get it under control, Where was the opposition coming from? Just smokers?
Tobacco industry.
Okay.
Why, they're the biggest liar there is. They really are. That and the NRA, the gun lobbies, are absolutely just fraudulent. I regard them as fraudulent. They promote it wherever they can, and that's where the opposition is. They've been claiming it wasn't harmful, first of all.
Yeah.
Well, finally we began to prove that it was harmful, because you don't see much cancer, primary cancer of the lung, in anybody but a smoker. And that's one of the reasons why we have trouble getting good lungs to transplant, because most of the lungs have been damaged, and if they're smokers, that's a third of our society are smokers. They still do. And now it's reducing, but it's been a big problem, and from a public health standpoint, probably that's where my efforts have done as much good as anywhere else. It just prolongs life. We first learned that it costs you 4.8 years of your life expectancy if you're a smoker. You're going to die that much earlier in life than if you're a non-smoker. And then if you have 2 packs a day, it's going to be almost 8 years of life that you lose, statistically. So it's a public health hazard, there is no question. Then we also learned that secondhand smoke, which is what kids inhale from parents who smoke, and even the spouses, we began to see a few smokes, primary cancer in the lung of women who were the spouse of smokers. Well, now they've started smoking, so quite a few women get cancer of the lung. They're almost as bad as the men. It's a sad story. And the gun lobby also. I have no use for guns in the carrying around. We have guns, but the authorities should have the guns. I'm disturbed by some of what I see now going on. I saw yesterday somebody down in Texas wants to institute a law down there and let even students carry them, because they're outlawed now on the campuses. They should be. We don't need guns on the campus.
Yeah. Well, as a doctor, I mean, did you ever have occasions to treat sort of chest wounds, bullet wounds, things like that?
Well, over the years, when I first came here in Grand Rapids, even though this is just a Grand Rapids experience, we would routinely get called out. We had to run a rotation and call from emergency room to the hospital. So we might get called out. We used to see gunshot wounds and also stabbings. And today, you not only see some of those, but we got a lot more people now than we had back in 1946. And so we have more automobile accidents, and also fights and drinking and so on. That's still there, but it isn't. It's quite a changed scene. And now, of course, we have emergency room physicians that generally, if they get in enough trouble, they always call us anyway. So that's a changed scene. It's almost like what's happened in the treatment of tuberculosis with streptomycin and other anti-TB drugs. Tuberculosis has changed substantially too. It's mostly under control if it's known, and then we have incidents also of immunity to drugs too, developing if there are too many of them used. But that whole scene has changed. And I saw it first when I saw penicillin being used on pneumonia. Sick people, very sick, high fever, give them some penicillin intravenously. Next day they're sitting up having breakfast.
Yeah, you've seen a lot of medical history.
Oh yeah, right.
An awful lot has changed over the course of that time. All right. Well, this tape looks to be about out, and I think we've kind of run through your core story here. So
That's all right.
we'll kind of close out this session, and thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.
Yeah. Now you set up a additional